Good evening my friends, and welcome, back to Relax to Sleep. It is my privilege to guide you to sleep with this story. The music will continue to play, so they can accompany you a little longer while you sleep. Now, close your eyes and drift into sleep with today's story, Rainfall in a Quiet Village. It began with a whisper. The kind of whisper only the trees seem to understand. An early hush that fell over the narrow cobblestone lanes and moss-covered rooftops of the village of Ellmere. Nestled between rolling hills and a sleepy forest, Ellmere was the kind of place that didn't appear on most maps. It didn't need to. The people who needed to find it always did, somehow. The first raindrop fell just past dusk, landing with a soft patter on the windowsill of a cottage at the edge of the village. Inside, warm lamplight glowed golden against the deepening gray outside. The kettle on the wood-burning stove began to sing, and Margot, a woman well into her 70s with kind eyes and a spine that curved gently like the path behind her house, turned to pour the water over a waiting teapot. As the tea steeped, she sat down in her favorite armchair, a patchy thing older than the house itself. She pulled a woolen blanket over her knees and glanced out the window. The world was already shimmering with wet light, cobblestones slick with the sheen of the rain, lanterns casting soft halos through the mist. It was the kind of rain that made time slow down. The kind that turned the tick of the old clock into a lullaby. The kind that told the body it was time to rest. In the distance, through the gentle drizzle, the faint clip-clop of a horse could be heard, a carriage, returning from the hills, perhaps. Or maybe just the wind playing tricks again. Margot's tea was warm and floral. Chamomile and elderflower, from the dried bundles she kept above the hearth. With each sip, her shoulders softened, her breath deepened, and the rain continued its quiet performance on the roof. Ellmere had known rain before, years of it, in fact. But this night's rain felt different. As if it carried stories in its fall. Not grand, sweeping epics, but soft tales, almost forgotten. Tales of quiet gardens and letters never sent. Of music played just for the birds. Of paths taken slowly, for the joy of the walk itself. And so it began. The rainfall in the quiet village. A night that would unfold like a lullaby, told one drop at a time. As night settled deeper over Ellmere, the mist grew thicker. Rain pooled in the low dips between cobblestones, the water mirroring the glow of the oil lanterns that lined the narrow streets. Their light, warm and golden, flickered slightly in the rain, as if bowing to the rhythm of the weather. From her chair, Margot watched as a figure ambled slowly through the fog, the shape only becoming clear as it passed beneath one of the lanterns, a boy of about 12, wrapped in a too-large coat, the hood pulled snug over his head. He paused, lifting his face to the sky, letting the cool drops fall over him, and then moved along. That was Theo, the baker's youngest son. Always out for late walks. He said the rain helped him think. Margot liked that about him. In the square, the small shop windows were fogged and dimmed, but still offered hints of their wares. A basket of hand-knit scarves here. Jars of blackberry jam there. The scent of rising dough drifted from the bakery, mixing with the petrichor and wood smoke in the air. Inside the inn, just off the square, old Mr. Fenn lit a fire in the hearth. A few villagers sat scattered about the room, reading, knitting, listening to the rain as it tapped the windows. The inn had seen generations come and go, and each one had left behind a story in its walls. None of them loud. All of them kind. Margot's cottage, though tucked at the village's edge, still felt deeply a part of it. She knew when the grocer's son had his first crush, when the mayor's cat had kittens, when the first snowflake would likely fall. It wasn't magic, really. Just time and attention. And Ellmere made it easy to pay attention. She rose slowly, placing her empty teacup on the table, and walked to the fireplace. With practiced ease, she added a few logs, coaxing the embers into a soft, crackling glow. The warmth danced across her hands as she held them close, her thoughts wandering. The rain grew steadier. It wasn't hurried. It simply was. The kind of rain that held space for silence. In another cottage, someone strummed a quiet chord on an old guitar. Across the street, the librarian read aloud to his cat. Two friends played chess by candlelight. The village was quiet, but not asleep, not yet. It was resting. Breathing in the calm, and out the clutter. Outside, the fog thickened, wrapping the world in soft cotton and golden halos. Ellmere, bathed in rain and light, dreamed with its eyes open. By the next hour, the rainfall had deepened into a steady rhythm, a gentle symphony played on rooftops, gutters, and garden leaves. Margot moved through her small home, setting things in order not out of necessity, but out of ritual. A folded shawl here, a candle lit there. In a place like Ellmere, rituals had weight. They kept the heart steady and the soul soothed. She stopped by the windowsill in her kitchen. There, nestled between two clay pots of mint and lemon balm, sat a small wooden box. Worn at the corners, polished by decades of hands, it held what she called her rainy day letters. Margot opened the lid slowly. Inside were envelopes of all shades, ivory, cream, the palest lavender, each tied with string. Letters she had written, some to friends long past, some to family who lived far away, and a few to herself. She picked one at random, untied the string, and began to read aloud. To the sound of raindrops on the porch roof, and to the memory of walking barefoot through puddles on Old Willow Lane. Her voice, worn and warm, mingled with the sound of the rain, and the moment felt suspended in time. Reading the letter brought back more than just the words. It brought back the exact weight of the air that day, the smell of rain on summer grass, the laughter of her sister in the distance. It was as if, for a brief moment, the past and present sat beside each other at the same table. She smiled and placed the letter back. Across the village, in homes just as old and filled with just as many stories, others were also looking back. Rain has a way of making us reflect, doesn't it? It slows the world just enough to catch up with old thoughts, to visit memories we've kept tucked away. Old Mrs. Cleary ran her fingers over a photo album from a Parisian holiday long ago. Jasper, the watchmaker, took out a small toy train he hadn't touched since his children were young. And little Eliza, not more than 8, sat at her bedroom window and imagined what kind of clouds made rain like this. Back at the cottage, Margot lit another candle, its flame wobbling slightly as if unsure whether to settle or dance. The window beside her blurred with droplets, each one a tiny lens warping the golden light. The village breathed slow. The stories, like the rain, fell gently. And Margot, surrounded by memory, let the rhythm of the rainfall become her lullaby once more. At the far end of the village, tucked between the post office and the old mill road, sat Jasper's shop. Ellmere timepieces and repairs. The windows were always fogged in the winter months, and tonight was no exception. The warm glow from inside softened the edges of the rainy world outside, turning the shop into a lantern of its own. Jasper himself was a slender man in his early 80s, with silver hair that curled gently over his collar and hands that still moved with remarkable steadiness. He had lived in Ellmere his entire life. He had once thought of leaving. He'd even packed a suitcase, once, decades ago. But the suitcase gathered dust, and so did the plans, until they felt like someone else's story. He was working on a pocket watch tonight, its tiny gears spread before him like puzzle pieces. A fine pair of tweezers in one hand, a loop in the other, he moved in near silence. The only sounds were the ticking of the dozen clocks around him and the ever-present rainfall tapping the windows. Behind the counter, a brass kettle sat warming on a small burner. Occasionally, Jasper paused to pour himself a cup of tea, always 2 spoonfuls of honey, no milk. Just the way his late wife, Marianne, had liked it. A photograph of her still sat on the corner of the workbench, smiling gently under a wide-brimmed hat, a sunflower field blooming behind her. She had loved rainy nights. Said they reminded her that the world still had a rhythm, even when everything felt uncertain. Jasper finished reassembling the watch and wound it carefully. It began ticking immediately, a sound that filled the small shop like the beginning of a favorite song. He smiled, not at the success of the repair, but at the familiarity of it. The quiet affirmation that life, no matter how small, continued in motion. He leaned back in his chair and listened. Outside, the rain poured steadily, a patient companion to his work. On the shelves around him, cuckoo clocks and mantel clocks ticked in perfect harmony, like a roomful of gentle conversations. He thought about the past, not in longing, but with appreciation. About the first time he met Marianne on the bridge near the bakery. About the watch he made for their wedding. About the time their daughter painted the shop door lavender because she thought it needed more color. Memories wrapped themselves around him like an old quilt. The shop, the rain, the clocks. All joined in quiet understanding. This night, like so many before it, asked for nothing but stillness. The bell above the door jingled softly. Not with urgency, but with familiarity. "Evening, Jasper," came a voice, Theo, the baker's son, water dripping from his coat. He held up a small alarm clock, the same one he'd been bringing back for repairs every few months. "Stopped again, did it?" Jasper asked, already reaching for a cloth. Theo grinned. "Or maybe I just wanted to visit." The two shared a moment, the kind that doesn't need words. Theo settled into the corner chair while Jasper looked over the clock. No rush. No noise. Just two people sharing time under a rainy sky. The night outside deepened, the village cloaked in mist and memory. And in that quiet shop, amidst ticking hands and golden light, another chapter unfolded, simple, silent, and full of warmth. Farther down the village lane, past the schoolhouse and the stone bridge that crossed the narrow stream, stood a great sycamore tree. Its broad canopy stretched proudly over the path like a natural umbrella, and even in the soft downpour, a dry patch of earth lay beneath its shelter. It had been there long before most houses, its roots interwoven with the rhythm of Ellmere itself. By day, children would gather beneath it, books in hand, to read aloud or whisper secrets. The village called it the reading tree. Tonight, as raindrops whispered on its uppermost leaves, it watched over a solitary figure seated on a wooden bench nestled between its roots. It was Elsie, the village librarian. Her gray coat was damp at the sleeves, but her eyes sparkled behind thin-rimmed glasses as she turned the pages of a thick, leather-bound book. Her black umbrella leaned against the bench, unused. Rain didn't bother Elsie. Not when there was a good story in hand. The reading tree had always been her favorite place. She'd read every book in the village library, twice, some 3 times, but nothing compared to reading under the sycamore during a rainfall. The sounds of pages turning, leaves dripping, and distant bells echoing from the clock tower created a symphony no orchestra could match. Her book tonight was one she'd read every year on the same date, an old tale of a lost traveler who wandered into a village that didn't appear on any maps. The kind of tale that felt suspiciously close to home. As she read, a warm light bloomed down the path. A lantern, swinging gently from the hand of Eliza's father, Thomas. He was bringing his daughter a blanket she'd forgotten at the library earlier. He spotted Elsie and gave a little wave. "You'll catch a chill," he said gently. Elsie smiled. "Not with this story." He left the blanket beside her, tucked under the edge of the bench. "Stay dry," he added, knowing full well she wouldn't leave until the chapter ended. She nodded, and he disappeared back down the misty lane. Elsie turned another page. The rain above her picked up slightly, and yet beneath the tree it stayed dry, a little miracle she never questioned. The tree had always kept her safe, even when the world outside hadn't. She was halfway through a paragraph when a soft, wet nose nudged her hand. A golden retriever, old and gentle, had settled beside the bench. "Hello, Barley," she said, rubbing behind his ears. He didn't belong to anyone, really. Or maybe he belonged to everyone. Barley wandered the village at his leisure, never missing a meal, always knowing where comfort could be found. He leaned against Elsie's leg and sighed contentedly. Together, woman and dog sat in the cocoon of roots and rain, the sycamore above them humming with droplets. Time slowed, not in a dramatic way, but in the way it does when everything is just as it should be. Elsie's eyes grew heavy. The story blurred slightly. She closed the book gently, placed it on her lap, and let her head rest against the curve of the tree. Barley didn't move. All around them, Ellmere breathed a little deeper. Another chapter closed. And the rain, steady and serene, continued to fall. As the village slept, or rested, in its own gentle way, the scent of warm bread rose like a blanket through the square. The bakery, nestled between the apothecary and the bookbinder's shop, glowed with life. Though the hour was late, the ovens were wide awake. Inside, the walls were painted with decades of flowery handprints and family laughter. Loaves of every kind lined wooden shelves, rye, sourdough, braided brioche, and the occasional experimental oat and cinnamon creation. Some still steamed where they sat cooling beside the wide, stone oven. Edgar, the baker, stood in the center of it all. Tall and barrel-chested with flour dusting his beard, he was the type of man who never seemed rushed despite always being busy. His hands, calloused and careful, moved with rhythm born of muscle memory, kneading dough, twisting rolls, dusting trays with cornmeal. Theo sat nearby, perched on a tall stool with a cup of warm milk in his hands. He had dropped in after his visit with Jasper, knowing full well that his father would still be working. Couldn't sleep. Edgar asked without turning around. Theo shook his head. The rain's too nice. Edgar chuckled. Best kind of noise to think in. The two shared a quiet moment. It wasn't unusual. Theo often stopped by the bakery late at night. Sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was easy. Like the dough Edgar worked, it rose and rested with care. Theo glanced toward the window. The glass fogged slightly from the oven's warmth, but he could still see the glisten of the cobblestones, the flicker of a lantern outside, the soft blur of mist that painted the world like a watercolor. "What are you baking tonight?" Theo asked. "Rye for the inn," Edgar replied. "And a batch of honey oat for Mrs. Finch. She says it helps her sleep." Theo grinned. "Everything you bake helps people sleep." Edgar raised an eyebrow, amused. "Not the espresso tarts, I hope." They both laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that fit well with the sound of rain and rolling pins. On a low shelf beneath the counter, a small wooden box held handwritten recipe cards, some passed down from Edgar's grandfather, others invented on rainy nights like this one. One particular card had a smudge of raspberry jam in the corner and a tiny, nearly illegible note that read, "For cold nights and tired hearts." As the next batch of dough rose beneath a linen cloth, Edgar wiped his hands and poured himself a cup of chamomile tea. He handed a fresh biscuit to Theo, still warm, golden at the edges. "You know," Edgar said, watching the rain slide slowly down the window, "when you're older, these nights will be the ones you remember." Theo nodded, chewing thoughtfully. They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. The oven hummed softly. Rain tapped its lullaby on the roof. And in that small, fragrant space, father and son sat beneath the weight of years yet to come, grounded in the simple joy of warmth, bread, and quiet companionship. Outside, the village remained still, wrapped in mist and memory. And the rain, ever steady, stitched the hours together. Beyond the heart of the village, where the cobblestones gave way to gravel and the lanterns grew fewer, there stretched a narrow stone bridge arched gracefully over Silver Creek. Named not for any precious metal, but for the way moonlight shimmered on its rippling surface, the creek was more a quiet stream than a true river. Still, it was beloved. The bridge itself was old, perhaps older than any building in Ellmere. Its stones were uneven, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Moss lined the edges, and tiny white blossoms bloomed between the cracks during spring. On rainy nights like this one, the bridge glistened in a dreamy, almost ethereal way. On this particular night, Marianne DuPont stood at the center of the bridge, wrapped in a long navy coat, her scarf tucked under her chin. She was neither young nor old, a woman somewhere between seasons, and always seen with a sketchbook under her arm. She was Ellmere's quiet artist, known for watercolors that captured not just the appearance of the village, but its emotion. She often walked here in the evenings, especially when it rained. Said it helped her clear her mind, helped her see. Tonight, she wasn't sketching, only standing, looking out at the current below, watching the rain create tiny ripples that turned the reflections of trees and stars into soft kaleidoscopes. She leaned over the edge slightly, noting how the lantern light behind her danced on the surface of the creek. It reminded her of a dream she once had as a girl, one where the rain painted colors across the water instead of ripples. In her coat pocket, her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. A letter she'd written but hadn't yet mailed. It was addressed to an old friend she hadn't seen in years, someone who once painted beside her under the oak tree near the meadow. Someone she still thought of when the rain fell. She didn't open the letter. Just held it, as if the weight of it grounded her. Across the bridge, coming up from the path near the woods, appeared Nora, Ellmere's schoolteacher, umbrella in hand. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, a single pencil still tucked behind her ear. She was humming something soft, barely audible over the rain. "Evening, Marianne," Nora said as she approached. "Evening," Marianne replied, her voice warm. Nora stopped beside her, holding the umbrella over both of them. "Waiting for something?" she asked. Marianne shook her head. "Just listening." They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the rain, watching the stream, watching the world slow down. Finally, Nora spoke again. "I used to think I had to leave Ellmere to find something bigger. Now, I think the biggest things are the quiet ones we hardly notice." Marianne smiled. "I think the rain teaches us that." The two women watched as a single leaf floated down the stream, spinning gently, rain collecting in tiny pools along its curved spine. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called. The sky, heavy with mist, glowed faintly from the village lights behind them. And the rain, as always, played its soft music, timeless and true. They stayed on the bridge a little longer, two silhouettes sharing silence. Another piece of the night unfolding, quietly. To the east of Ellmere, just beyond the line of birch trees and a shallow rise of land, lay Old Wren's meadow. In spring and summer, it was blanketed in wildflowers. In autumn, it turned a rustling gold. But in the rain, it shimmered like a secret, a stretch of soft grass and memory, with no fences to contain it. Few visited the meadow at night, but tonight, someone had lit lanterns along its edge. Small paper lanterns, carefully placed and glowing like fallen stars. They flickered gently in the mist, not bright enough to wake the village, but warm enough to guide the few who wander. At the center of the meadow stood a small, weathered gazebo, circular, wooden, with ivy curling around its beams. Inside it, Ivy Bell, yes, Ivy, like the flower, sat cross-legged on a wool blanket, cradling a journal in her lap. Her hair was wrapped in a green scarf, and her fingers were smudged with ink. Ivy was one of the newest residents of Ellmere. She'd come from a far-off city, looking for something she couldn't quite name. She had rented a cottage near the old mill and quickly become known for her quiet presence, the wind chimes that hung from her porch, and the way she always asked good questions. Tonight, she was writing. Not with urgency, but with presence. She paused often between sentences to listen to the rain and sip her tea from a thermos. A small candle glowed beside her. In her journal were observations. Noticing how the grass bowed under the weight of raindrops, how the trees in the distance swayed like they were slow dancing, how even silence had texture here. Now and then, she wrote a line of poetry. Nothing rhymed. Nothing needed to. Just a string of images to honor the feeling of this moment. She had lit the lanterns earlier, on a whim. She thought perhaps someone might see them. Not necessarily to join her, but to know they weren't alone. And someone had. A soft crunch of footsteps on damp grass announced the arrival of Samuel, the postman, who was known to take long walks when he couldn't sleep. His coat was buttoned all the way up, a wool cap snug on his head. "I thought I might find you here," he said as he approached the gazebo. "I thought someone might," Ivy replied, offering a smile. He didn't ask to sit, but she made space anyway. For a few minutes, they didn't speak. The rain whispered all around them, steady and kind. Then Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "A letter for you." Found it slipped under the library door. No name on the return. Ivy accepted it, curiosity lighting her eyes. She didn't open it yet. She liked to wait for the right moment. "Do you think it'll still be raining in the morning?" she asked. Samuel shrugged gently. "I hope so. Some mornings deserve rain." They sat side by side, watching the lanterns glow and fade in the shifting mist. The meadow seemed to breathe with them, alive, quiet, ancient. Above them, the clouds turned slowly, softly. A moon tried to peek through but settled for casting a silvery glow from behind the veil. In the distance, the village clock struck the hour, muffled by the weather. Ivy tucked the letter into her journal and rested her head on the gazebo's wooden post. "Thank you for the mail," she whispered. Samuel nodded. The rain, with all its patience, continued to fall. Threading its rhythm through every blade of grass, every quiet heart, every night-lit lantern. The Ellmere bookshop, nestled in the curve of the village square, was one of those places that had never needed to close. Its owner, Callum Hart, lived just above it, in a room filled with dusty maps, half-filled journals, and the faint scent of dried lavender that drifted up through the floorboards from a sachet tucked behind the history section. Callum had inherited the shop from his uncle, who had inherited it from his mother before him. The books were arranged more by feeling than by title, stories of longing near the window, poetry beneath the spiral staircase, and tales of adventure beside the kettle in the back. Tonight, the shop was closed, but not dark. A few lamps remained lit, casting golden puddles of light across the wooden floor. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the tall windows. Inside, Callum sat at his desk by the fireplace in his upstairs room, pen in hand, tea cooling at his elbow. He wasn't writing anything in particular. Sometimes his journal became a letter. Sometimes it became a story. More often, it became a list of thoughts he didn't want to forget. Tonight, his pen moved slowly. The rain softens everything, even memory. I wonder if the wind knows how many secrets it carries. A lantern in the meadow tonight. A promise of warmth in the open dark. He paused to sip his tea, then glanced toward the small window over his desk. It was fogged at the edges, but through it he could see the outline of the square, the quiet fountain, the silhouettes of trees, the bakery's chimney still exhaling warmth. From the shelf beside him, he pulled down an old book bound in deep blue cloth. It was a journal of sorts, filled with letters never sent. Most were addressed simply, "To you, whoever you are." He flipped to a random page and read aloud. "If you find this place, you'll know. Not because of signs or maps, but because of how your heart quiets when you arrive. There are places in this world that hum in your frequency. This is one of them." He smiled, the words familiar and still comforting. A soft knock sounded at the back door below. Unusual for this hour, but not unwelcome. Callum set his book aside and made his way down the creaking stairs. At the door stood Nora, the schoolteacher, holding a book wrapped in cloth. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, eyes bright with the shimmer of rain. "Never," Callum replied, stepping aside. She handed him the book. "I borrowed this months ago. It's overdue in the most gracious sense." He took it gently. "And I trust it traveled well. It brought me more peace than I can say." He gestured toward the kettle. "Come in. The rain insists we not rush." They sat in the reading nook near the fireplace, tea warming their hands. Above them, the wind stirred a chime that hung from a ceiling beam. It gave a low, slow note, like the village itself letting out a sigh. "I sometimes think this place is more alive than we know," Nora said. Callum nodded. "It listens." And indeed, it did. The bookshop had always felt that way, pages turning softly even when no one was near, the scent of old paper rising like memory, and stories gently settling into the walls like roots. As they talked, rain slid in gentle rivers down the glass, and the village outside quieted even further, as if leaning in to listen. The hours passed not with urgency but like a lullaby, and in that small room above the shop, two kindred souls shared warmth, words, and the hush of a world wrapped in rain. At the northern edge of Ellmere, just past the old stone schoolhouse and a path lined with hedgerows, stood the clock tower. Not towering by modern standards, but noble in its own way. Capped in dark slate, with four brass clock faces that caught the morning sun when skies were clear. On rainy nights, like this one, the tower became a soft silhouette, half faded into the mist. The clock's inner workings were maintained by a single person, Mrs. Aldwin. No one quite remembered when she had taken over from the previous caretaker, and no one ever asked. She had always been the quiet figure ascending the tower's narrow spiral staircase each week to wind the gears, adjust the chimes, and whisper greetings to the resident bats. Tonight, she moved slowly up the steps, lantern in hand, her long coat brushing the damp stone walls. Her breath came in soft clouds, warm against the cool air. Each step echoed up and down the tower like a call and response. At the top, she opened the trapdoor to the clock room, a wide space of beams, pulleys, wheels, and gears. Rain tapped gently against the glass panes that protected the clock faces. From here, the whole village could be seen, or at least, imagined. The lights of homes flickered through the mist like watchful stars. She approached the central mechanism and turned the large brass crank. The gears hummed and clicked into a new rhythm, and with it, the bell high above stirred. It was not yet time to chime the hour. This visit was a quiet one, a ritual of caretaking. In a small chest beside the wall, she kept things not many would expect, a tin of lavender candies, an old book of haiku, and a bundle of folded paper cranes made long ago by her granddaughter. She took one out now, set it gently beside the bell lever, and gave it a nod, as if to say, "We're still here." Mrs. Aldwin moved to the bench near the wall and sat down with a slow breath. The rain had a different sound up here, more like soft applause on the roof, distant and dignified. The sound of clouds breathing. She unwrapped one of the candies and let it melt on her tongue. Her eyes closed, and she imagined the village not as it looked now, but as it had looked 50 years ago. Children chasing each other down the lane. Her late husband laughing as he painted the front door robin's egg blue. A parade of umbrellas during a spring festival when the sky opened mid-celebration and nobody minded. She had seen many rains. This one, like the others, brought memories forward, not to ache, but to comfort. Below, the village breathed evenly. Somewhere in the square, a candle was lit. Somewhere in the inn, a lullaby was sung. Somewhere in a garden shed, someone was sketching wildflowers by lantern light. The bell above her gave a low, resonant hum. Just the weight of the wind shifting it slightly. Mrs. Aldwin smiled. She stood, gave the bell a fond pat, and began her descent. Back into the village. Back into the rain. Back into the long, lovely night. Beneath the wooden awning of the Ellmere post office, the rain danced its soft rhythm against the gutters. The post office had closed hours ago, its brass sign turned inward, curtains drawn. But inside, the lights still glowed with a steady warmth, and the old wooden sorting table was alive with envelopes and string. Samuel, the village postman, moved gently through the quiet space, finishing the last of his evening tasks. He was not in a hurry. Rainy nights, to him, were gifts. They slowed the world to a pace he preferred. He sorted letters by hand, as he always did. Each address was familiar. Some had quirks. A heart drawn in the corner, initials in looping calligraphy, a single word of encouragement tucked in the margin. He knew the handwriting of every person in Ellmere by now, not out of nosiness, but out of affection. Tonight, he paused before a special drawer, the one marked to hold. This was where he kept letters without recipients. Not because they were undeliverable, but because the senders hadn't finished them. They were letters dropped off by villagers who weren't ready to mail them. Love notes still unsure, apologies needing courage, memories too sharp to send. He opened the drawer and looked inside. A dozen letters, maybe more, sat quietly in the dark. Each one, in its own way, a story paused mid-thought. Samuel pulled one out and read the envelope, to the one who still dreams of the lake. No name, no return. Just the familiar paper of the bookshop's writing corner. He held it for a moment, then placed it back gently. Beside the drawer sat a thick notebook. Samuel's log of days. He opened it and wrote, Rainfall, soft. Lanterns seen from the meadow. Ivy sent word through Nora. Callum's light stayed on late. No foxes tonight. The sky breathes deep. He closed the book, ran his hand over the cover, and stepped outside. The rain met him like an old friend. His boots splashed gently as he crossed the lane, heading toward the old iron bench beneath the plane tree. It was his spot. A place to end the day. As he sat, a shadow moved near the hedge. A small red fox, pausing in the rain, nose lifted to the breeze. Samuel didn't move. The fox stared for a moment, then trotted away silently. He leaned back, letting the rain tap the brim of his cap, the sound rich and reassuring. Around him, the village held its stillness. No one rushed. No one stirred. All was as it should be. And in the drawer at the post office, the letters waited, content to remain unread, held safe in the silence of a rainy night. Behind the ivy-wrapped cottage at the very end of Lavender Lane, beyond the low stone wall and the winding row of daffodils, there stood a garden shed. Not particularly large, not especially elegant. But it was known throughout Ellmere as the place where Emmeline Moss spent her evenings. Emmeline was the village's quiet caretaker of all things green. She tended the community garden, advised on soil and seed, and had a soft spot for plants that most people overlooked. Dandelions, clover, wild thistle. Her shed was more than a workspace. It was her retreat. Rain fell steady on the roof of the shed, creating a gentle drumming sound that mingled with the soft scratch of pencil on paper. Emmeline sat at her workbench under a low-hanging lamp, sketching the anatomy of a poppy seed pod in her garden journal. The space smelled of rosemary and cedar shavings, earth and beeswax. Bundles of drying herbs hung overhead, lavender, chamomile, mint. Glass jars lined the shelves, each labeled in careful cursive. Some held seeds. Others, petals. A few, tiny stones she'd found during morning walks. A small radio played quietly in the background, an old program from the university in Thatchwood, something about botany and folklore. The kind of thing only Emmeline would enjoy so completely. A soft knock tapped on the door. She turned, surprised but not alarmed. Outside stood Elsie, the librarian, her coat damp, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I found something I think belongs to you," Elsie said with a smile. Emmeline opened the door wider. "Come in. You'll get soaked." The two women settled at the bench with mugs of nettle tea. Elsie placed the package on the table. It was in the back of the library closet. "I think it belonged to your grandmother." A seed catalog from 1932. Handwritten notes all over it. Emmeline's eyes lit up. She unwrapped the paper and opened the fragile booklet. Inside, in faded ink, were her grandmother's familiar notes, recipes for tinctures, thoughts on moon phases, observations about weather and bloom cycles. "This is," Emmeline began, but the words didn't come. Instead, she ran her fingers gently over the pages, smiling softly. "I thought you'd like it," Elsie said. "More than like." "Thank you." Outside, the rain thickened slightly. Inside, time slowed. The two friends sipped tea and turned pages, pausing to laugh over curious remedies and surprisingly poetic notations. It was as if Emmeline's grandmother had returned for the evening, whispering stories through ink and paper. The warmth of the lamp, the scent of herbs, the hush of the rain, it all combined into something sacred. A night stitched together not with grand events, but with gentle presence. When Elsie rose to leave, Emmeline wrapped the catalogue in cloth and placed it carefully on the shelf beside her journal. "Come by any time," she said. "I always do," Elsie replied. And with that, the door shut gently behind her, and the sound of the rain grew just a little louder, as if to fill the space left by a friend. Emmeline picked up her pencil again, turned to a fresh page, and began to sketch the seeds of the future. At the highest point of the village, perched atop Wren Hill, stood the oldest house in Ellmere. Built of weathered brick and crowned with tall chimneys, it had watched over the rooftops and winding streets for more than 2 centuries. Most villagers knew it simply as the Wren House. Tonight, its attic window glowed faintly, a soft, flickering amber beacon in the rain. Inside, Julian Thorne, Ellmere's unofficial historian, was seated in a tufted armchair by a low table cluttered with loose papers, books, and old lanterns. Rain tapped steadily against the slanted roof above, and a single oil lamp cast gentle shadows along the wooden beams. Julian had lived in the Wren house since inheriting it from an aunt who had collected stories as others might collect stamps or coins. She had filled every floor with memories. Trunks of letters, boxes of photographs, shelves of journals, each one marked with dates and names and whispers of other times. Now, Julian served as keeper of that legacy. Tonight, he was sorting through a leather-bound journal dated 1886. It belonged to someone named Alistair Wynne, a name only barely remembered now, once a cobbler, then a traveler, always a dreamer. The journal was filled with short entries about rain, about boots worn thin by long walks, about stars seen from mountaintops. Julian read aloud to the rain, "I stayed in a village today, one I didn't know I was looking for. The bread was warm. The people kind. I don't think it had a name, but I hope I find it again." Julian paused, smiling. He rose to place the journal on a shelf dedicated to journeys, then pulled out a box labeled Unplaced Memories. It was filled with scraps, photographs with no names, letters with no signatures, maps with paths drawn in red. From it, he selected a photograph of two girls holding hands on a garden swing, one wearing a straw hat, the other barefoot in the grass. No date. No place. Just laughter frozen in time. He pinned it to the memory board by his desk and wrote beneath it, "Perhaps the garden behind the bakery. Late spring." It didn't matter if it was right. What mattered was that it was remembered. The attic was filled with small sounds. The creak of the chair, the flutter of pages, the soft scrape of pen on paper. The kind of sounds that made the rain seem louder, and more comforting. Julian glanced at the window. Through the fogged glass, the lights of the village twinkled faintly. He imagined each home and the story unfolding inside it: Callum at the bookshop, Ivy in the meadow, Mrs. Aldwyn at the clock tower, Emmeline in her shed. So many lives, all stitched together by weather and time. He reached for another journal, older still, and settled back in his chair. The rain continued to fall. And above Ellmere, the attic light stayed on, keeping watch. Near the village square, behind the churchyard and adjacent to a tiny grove of alder trees, stood a cottage with green shutters and a slightly uneven chimney. Most days it smelled faintly of varnish and cedar, and most nights it sang. Inside lived Marius Bell, a retired music teacher with a fondness for rainy weather and out-of-tune pianos. His cottage was filled with instruments, some playable, some purely decorative, each with a story and a place. A mandolin by the windowsill. A cello that lived beside the hearth. A row of harmonicas on the shelf. But the centerpiece was the upright piano by the front window, the one he had lovingly restored over 3 winters. Tonight, Marius sat at that piano with a steaming mug of ginger tea resting atop its lid. Outside, the rain poured in steady waves, pattering against the windows and roof like an audience settled in for a concert. He played not for performance, but for memory. His fingers moved gently across the keys. Half a lullaby, half a hymn. It was a melody he never wrote down, one that changed with each evening, each rain, each breath. It belonged only to the moment. Down the lane, the music could just barely be heard, a soft echo wrapped in mist. For those still awake, it was a signal. A sign that all was well. Eliza, the young girl from the red-roofed house, listened from her bedroom window, counting the notes like stars. Callum, still awake in the bookshop, paused his writing to let the chords drift in. Even Barley, the golden retriever, settled by the back step of the bakery, tail thumping to the rhythm. Inside the cottage, Marius closed his eyes as he played. He thought of his mother's lullabies. Of the echoing choir in a faraway cathedral where he once studied. Of a girl named Clara who danced in the snow with a blue scarf and a voice like sunlight. He thought of all the songs he'd taught over the years and the few he'd kept only for himself. The rain joined in, not in harmony or counterpoint, but as a companion. Its rhythm against the glass filled the rests in the melody, a duet older than language. After a time, the music slowed. He lifted his hands from the keys, letting the final note fade. Silence followed, not empty, but full. The kind of silence that holds the weight of every sound that came before it. He sat for a moment, then sipped his tea. Warmth bloomed in his chest, the comfort of old wood and wool slippers. On the windowsill, a small bird, soaked from the rain, hopped beneath the eaves, fluffing its feathers. Marius cracked the window and set a few seeds on the ledge. The bird chirped once in thanks before fluttering off into the damp dark. Marius leaned back and looked out across the village, now sleeping. He hummed the tune once more, just to himself, then rose to light the fire. The piano rested. The rain continued. And Ellmere, beneath its blanket of clouds and lullabies, breathed deeply in its sleep. The rain had not stopped, but it had changed. It had softened, thinned, becoming more of a mist than a downpour. The kind of rain that felt like breath against skin, gentle and quiet. The village of Ellmere stirred not because of the sound of alarms or morning bells, but because of something older and deeper, light. The first glow of dawn, pale and diffused through low clouds, crept gently over rooftops and curled through window panes. Rain-slicked cobblestones shone like old coins. Smoke began to curl from chimneys once more, and doorways blinked to life with the warm yellow of lanterns and hearths. Margot, waking before the sun fully rose, moved through her cottage with practiced ease. The kettles sang again, and her woolen blanket, now draped over her shoulders, carried the comforting scent of last night's rain. She placed her cup of tea on the windowsill and opened the latch. Outside, the air smelled of moss and new beginnings. Across the square, Edgar at the bakery was already pulling the first loaves from the oven. The scent of bread rolled through the village in warm waves, greeted by the cool mist like an old friend. He placed a roll in a small paper bag and set it on the windowsill, an unspoken offering for Barley, who would surely pass by soon. At the bookshop, Callum opened the shutters upstairs. He stretched and watched as the mist shifted in the square, revealing silhouettes of familiar figures, Nora carrying her satchel of lesson plans, Theo in his too big coat, holding a pastry with both hands. Julian, high in the Wren house attic, finished writing a final note on the margin of an old journal. The quietest nights carry the brightest echoes. Ivy stood at the edge of the meadow, lantern still in hand, blinking at the soft blush of the sky. She hadn't gone home at all, but slept on the blanket beneath the gazebo, tucked beside her journal and letter. She smiled as she looked out at the field now shining with 1,000 raindrops, each one catching the dawn like a prism. Emmeline stirred in her garden shed, brushing sleep from her eyes and pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders. She stepped into the garden barefoot, feeling the damp soil beneath her toes, whispering good morning to the leaves as if they had waited for her. And Mrs. Aldwin, returning down the clock tower steps, paused one last time at the base to listen, not to the ticking, but to the silence. That kind of silence that only comes after rain, filled not with emptiness, but with presence. One by one, the villagers began to greet the day. Not with loud words or bustling noise, but with soft footsteps, kind glances, warm hands around mugs. The rain had not ceased completely. But it no longer fell. It hovered, as if watching, as if blessing. And as the village came to life beneath its soft sky, one thing became clear: the night had not passed. It had simply transformed. And the story, written in mist and memory, would continue, quietly, gently, beautifully, as Ellmere always did. As the mist lifted and the soft golden haze of morning deepened, Ellmere slowly unfolded like a letter pulled from an envelope, familiar, treasured, full of small wonders waiting to be read. In the square, the first market carts were being rolled into place. Baskets of pears, jars of honey, loaves of bread, and bunches of lavender found their way to weathered wooden tables. The villagers moved without rush, as though the rhythm of the rain had not quite left their bones. Theo helped his father arrange fresh pastries while sneaking bites when he thought no one noticed. Elsie wheeled over a box of old books for a tiny outdoor exchange she held each Saturday. Emmeline arrived with hand-tied bundles of herbs and smiled at Ivy, who had brought sketches from the meadow pressed into small cards. Nora greeted her students near the old fountain, their notebooks tucked under arms, eyes still sleepy but bright. Barley wandered between legs and stalls, receiving head scratches and the occasional corner of bread. And at the edge of the market, Margot sat on a folding chair with her knitting, her eyes flicking up occasionally to watch the square come alive, her needles moving in a calm, practiced rhythm. Callum set a small wooden sign beside the bookshop table: "Today's story, yours." Julian arrived last, placing an envelope into the community box, unlabeled, and signed. He gave a nod to no one in particular and took a seat beside Mrs. Aldrin, who had already brewed tea in a thermos and brought extra cups. They all existed together in the quiet joy of that moment, an orchestra without sheet music, playing in harmony because they had lived this song 1,000 times before. As the sun stretched higher and the last clouds faded into wisps, the village of Ellmere felt gently held, by the sky, by the rain's memory, by each other. And though no great announcements were made, and no bells rang beyond their hour, something was understood between them: that peace does not always arrive with grand gestures. That comfort can be carried in a raindrop, in the creak of an old chair, in the smell of fresh bread, in the turning of a page. That stories need not end with a final word, but can drift softly onward, like mist curling above the rooftops. And that this night, the long, quiet, rainy night in Ellmere, was one such story. Left unspoken, but not forgotten. Time in Ellmere was not measured by clocks alone, though the bell in the clock tower still rang each hour with gentle clarity. It was measured by rhythm, by the growing and fading of light, the smell of bread, the blooming of violets, the return of rain. Weeks passed. Seasons shifted. And one afternoon, just as the first petals began to scatter from the orchard trees, the sky turned again to gray. Rain returned. Not a storm. Not a downpour. But a familiar patter on rooftops and leaves. A whispering hush that fell over the village like a memory revisited. Windows opened slightly to let the scent in. Teapots steamed again. Boots appeared beside doors. Old songs drifted from the radio in Marius's cottage. In the meadow, Ivy tilted her face to the clouds with a quiet smile, her sketchbook damp with mist. Callum placed a fresh journal by the bookshop window labeled, "Tell me what the rain reminded you of." Margot wrapped her blanket tight and looked to the path beyond her garden, watching it blur again in that lovely way rain always did. Julian added a page to the village archive, April 27th, the rain returned. Everything remembered itself. Barley found a dry spot beneath the baker's awning and snoozed without worry. And somewhere on a windowsill, an unopened letter, addressed simply to you, gathered a single drop of rain before being carried away by a gentle breeze, its paper gliding over fields and rooftops and river bends. Because stories, like Rainfall, return when the time is right. And Ellmere, with its quiet paths and kind silences, would be there to receive them. Always.